Hello and welcome to the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundie. This podcast has a simple mission: to have discussions that reveal something important about life and how best to live it. My guests range from the biggest sporting names on the planet through to neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists and world-renowned thinkers. We talk about things like how to skillfully relate to uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the power of acceptance and psychological flexibility, how to get your circadian rhythms in sync to feel your best, right through to the nature of reality. These conversations and the bite-sized episodes have the power to change your life. This is a re-release of a conversation I first had 3 years ago with Dr. Pippa Grange about psychological fear. Now, Dr. Grange is the former England football psychologist who was really credited with helping to transform the England men's football team's fortunes at the 2018 World Cup when they really broke through and reached the semi-finals for the first time since 1990. In this episode, Pippa explains the difference between in-the-moment fear and not good enough fear. And it's the latter that really is the focus of our conversation and which is lurking behind many of our self-defeating behaviours. Pippa's book, which we referenced during this conversation, is called Fear Less: How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. Pippa Grange, Dr. Pippa Grange, how are you?
I'm really well, thanks, Simon. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm thrilled to speak to you, to have you on the podcast. I've got to be honest, I've essentially been trying to track you down for over a year, and it's all become very quickly apparent why I've been unable to a certain degree at least, insofar as you've been clearly working on this book, haven't you?
I have, yeah. Well, I actually finished it in December last year, which is interesting timing now for it to be out yesterday, because it was, I had no idea at the time that it would be in the middle of a pandemic and fear would be such a big topic. But yes, I've been deeply involved in that for the last period of time, and obviously my work with Right to Dream alongside, which takes me to Denmark and Ghana. So I haven't been easy to track down. You've done a good job.
You're very, very hard to track down. And like you say, right at a kind of key moment in human history, really, with fear being so pervasive, and what you're talking about in terms of redefining what's important, understanding the role that fear plays in so much of society, sport, ourselves. It does really feel of the moment. As I said, I spoke to Kath Bishop about the problem with winning and redefining what is important and winning. And I just think it's very interesting that her work and your work have come at this moment. It does feel like it's right on cue.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose Kath Bishop would have been the same. Neither of us could have predicted that this would have been the case, but I'm very grateful that maybe the things that I've been exploring and trying to put down in words will be helpful for that reason. Facing, what does a new normal look like, and where do we go from here from a coronavirus perspective, as well as all the things that I started talking about. And I listened to your podcast with Kath, and I thought I had an immediate professional crush on her. I thought that was a great conversation, and I couldn't be more on the same page with her. She was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the timing with that, with even the stuff that came through with British gymnastics, that same week that we spoke, or the same week that it came out, I mean, it was quite remarkable, the timing. And do you describe yourself as a culture change specialist? People would otherwise know you as a performance psychologist. You lean towards the former. Your approach seems to be very holistic. And in fact, when I read your work, there's a touch of the therapist in the way that you work with people.
I think I started off, my first doctoral degree was applied performance psychology, and that's what I learned. But I did learn it from the perspective of the person, the athlete, being central, sort of at the center of the hub, so to speak. So I'd always had that bent. But my first gig was with the AFL Players Association in Australia, and I set up their psychology services for players and their families, AFL players and their families. And it was largely off-field work. So it was all about how they were dealing with the stuff of life, whether that was depression, injury management, and what that meant for their career, transitions, drugs, alcohol, relationship difficulties, all of the sort of normal stuff that any human being can encounter, and what that meant in the context of professional sport. So I did really take a therapeutic perspective for those first 5 years of my career, and I think that's shaped my view very much over time.
In the book, you touch on the spiritual, the unscientific, the ineffable, if you like. So I sort of thought, in a world of marginal gains, you've got a touch of the shaman about you.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, yeah. And I think that, I talk about this sort of wildly unscientific idea of soul, but soul has been around for way longer than science, actually, and in all of the wisdom traditions. But not only that, in a way of in a sort of civilized society, whether we want to talk about sort of, Socrates and the Greeks and the archetypes and the gods, and the place that soul played in understanding of what life meant, what was the point and purpose of life. It's always been very present. And I think in the, sort of post-Renaissance and the move into an industrialized society, I think that we have swung the pendulum a bit too far away from all forms of mystery and made only the things that are concrete and provable have true value. And I think that's a real loss, because we need both. It's not an either or proposition, but for a rich life and what I call in the book winning deep, we absolutely need both sides of that coin to be available and valid in life.
A lot of what you talk about is emotion, fear, connection, vulnerability. And what came through is your own vulnerability as well. I mean, how much of the importance you put on things like vulnerability, connection, has been shaped by your own personal journey and emotional hurts that you've faced and overcome? Because clearly you've personally been through a hell of a lot.
I think it's inevitable to a degree. I had this conversation with a coach a while ago, asking whether I thought that it was necessary for a person to have faced adversity to be truly resilient in life and in sport. And adversity itself isn't enough to create resilience or to, shape a worldview. You have to make sense of that adversity. You have to sort of do the work and the reflection and make meaning of what happened. Staying with just the hurt isn't a viable option for progress. And, just toughening up and bottling the adversity and the pain isn't a viable option either. So I would say that I've done the work. I continue to do the work. It's not a done deal. I have as many flaws as the next person and as much to work out as the next person. But I'm very invested in being as honest as I can be about what I feel and where I am. And you can't do that without vulnerability and without this idea of intimacy, of being, can I show you the real me? Can I be here and in a conversation with you and accept my flaws without having to airbrush them? And how much richer and deeper our conversations as human beings and our experiences as human beings become when we can just come as all of us. So I think that, yes, my personal journey has absolutely shaped that, and my own working out and meaning making. But, it's something I also see as a repeat pattern again and again in athletes and performers and people all through life that I work with, and I have the privilege of working with. This is just such a common thing. So we all have pain, we all have difficulty in our past and things that hurt. How have we made sense of that in who we want to be?
Pain can clearly be a powerful and important driver to growth and to enable people often to look back and be grateful for what they've been through, even if it's been absolutely awful at times. And, you talk about vulnerability and I think what the name of your book, so How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. And that losing yourself, I guess, is hiding parts of ourselves that perhaps we are rejecting in ourselves and imagining others to reject. And that's something that's clearly very pervasive throughout sport, throughout society, in organizations, in politics, in families, and in our own psyches, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think that, there's a big piece here. Vulnerability is one part of it, and shame is another part of it, which is sort of, it's something that we all experience and we all have in varying degrees, and it's easily triggered in us. But it's culturally reinforced and perpetuated quite often. And in those cultures where we feel like if we are exposed, or if we are seen to be dumb or not good enough or failed in some way, there will be just a veil of shame that falls, and it will be intolerable because it will mean that we're rejected. That's where we really go underground, or we either close down so much of our emotional self, our emotional and spiritual self, and just become more mechanical or robotic so that we can cope, kind of like a caricature of our natural selves, or we step out of the game entirely. And again, what a loss in either of those cases, because we are what we are, and we're naturally striving to be the best we can be, but those external shaming labels are very, very unhelpful for a fulfilling life.
Yeah, you talk about shame, and is your sense that the act of shaming is becoming more prominent because perhaps heightened by things like social media and stuff like that? I mean, it seems to be at the root of what some people are dubbing the cultural war that's going on in various arenas at the moment.
Yeah, I think, I think back to the English school systems, or not the system, I shouldn't say the system, but it's English school cultures and the sort of, growing up in the north of England, the normality of school bus and classroom and playground shaming and abuse and bullying, and how prevalent that has been in the psyche for, a long time. And think about it at that level. I think it's been there for quite some time, but the scaling up of it through social media has probably, brought it into the mainstream in ways that, we certainly didn't have 20 years ago. And there's maybe a protective factor for the person who wants to shame or bully when they're looking through a screen and not looking somebody in the face. That there's, we get things like cancel culture, where people just decide to rub somebody out completely, and then they're not valid, they're not worth anything. And that's obviously, that erodes the soul in tremendous ways. And it's a real shame we can't find a better version of ourselves.
And the person doing the cancelling, I think, it hurts the person who's being affected, but also the person who's perpetrating it, which I guess is true of all kind of acts of violence.
Yeah. When we become the critic or the judge, it's coming from the same source of fear. It's a fear of inadequacy. It's a fear of personal inadequacy that's at the source of that. So, when somebody feels the need to prove themselves as better than, and that they can only be better than when somebody else is worse than, or they're only a winner if somebody else is a loser, the root of that is fear. And it can look very powerful, and it can look very accomplished too. It quite often looks very accomplished. But the truth of the matter is that that's a fear of inadequacy, of not measuring up, and of being cast out on the basis of that. So it's taking and using power in a way to protect from feeling fear.
So, yeah, if you're shaming others or involved in that, and it can be quite subtle, then understanding that it's coming from a place of fear is a key thing to start to understand. Anyway, we're talking about fear, and one place where fear was abundantly obvious, at least until you came in, along with Gareth, was in English football. England often shamed by the media, shrunk on the big stage, time after time at tournaments. I think, probably reaching a nadir when they were knocked out of the Euros by Iceland. And then, you came in along with Gareth Southgate, and you do talk about yourself as someone who looks at culture. And clearly you helped dismantle that. I always think of the picture that I remember from the World Cup in 2018 when the whole vibe was so different, was that picture of the players on the floating toys in the hotel pool, sort of laughing and having fun. And it was clear there was just connection and vulnerability and, all those things that bring people together. But just going back, because I know you only came in a year previously in 2017, and I've seen you talk about it being the perception of it being the impossible job. Did you have fear about coming into an environment like that?
Not really, Simon, because I was coming back to England. I'd been in Australia for 20 years and LA for a couple of years before I came back. So I was an unknown quantity here, and I really felt like I didn't have anything to lose. I wasn't vested in football. I saw myself as a beginner in the sport, and I still do. And I just felt very sure by that stage of the game about what I really cared about and what I thought worked, which is centrally the quality of relationships that people have with each other, and the culture work. And I knew that that culture work was doable. So, I walked into a system that had improved out of sight already from 2016. Loads of good work had been done. Gareth had been in place for a year when I came in, and around about a year. And I had the opportunity to come in and join the dots and walk in and feel where things were at. And I had, as you pointed out, Gareth was very open. My bosses were very open to what kind of change needed to happen. So nobody had really talked about fear. I don't think anybody had really talked about fear in the way that we did there. Whether we talked about some of the really tough issues around racism and what we might experience in Russia, or fear of failing. And you don't have a whole heap of time with the players in international football. So the conversations with the organisation, with the staff, with the coaches, they're the ones that turn the dial a little bit, because they're the people who are orchestrating the wins. I'm an ally to that journey, and I bring different conversations in doing that. So I think that actually saying it out loud was something that was just ready. They were ready to hear. And, I've explained this before, but people assume that it was the technical work on the penalty spot that was the difference maker. And, the analysts and the coaches have done brilliant work on that, which I contributed to technically. But for me, the technical work was the least. That was a brilliant moment against Colombia. But it was not the powerful stuff. The powerful stuff was the ability to be themselves, to feel some more mental freedom, to have some fun, and to feel the depth and quality of relationships between staff and player, and player, and the team and the nation as well. So came in from all sorts of different angles to make that turn, I think.
It's interesting you say that, just talking about fear, because clearly fear is there kind of lurking in the background, and it can be all too easy to try and ignore it. But, if you shine the light of awareness on it, essentially, or acknowledge it and accept it, that's most of the battle, isn't it? Yeah,
it really is. It's like in the book I talk about the sort of overarching method being see it, face it, replace it. So unless you can actually pause for long enough and find the courage to see where the fear is and what the fear is in your life, you're probably going to be fixing the wrong thing. And that's the same in teams as, for individuals or in families or other kinds of organizations. But, most of us fear's really uncomfortable. So most of us want to brush it under the table and fix it too quickly before we've really had a look. What's the worst thing that could be exposed about me? What would happen if people thought I was a failure? What comes next? And really excavate and see the fear in your life. From there, you can start to face what it's costing you, how it's showing up, what it's preventing you from doing, which is a really important part, not just, how it plays out in the existing opportunities that you've got, but it stops us, so many of us, taking good risks. And then what might you replace it with?
Yeah, so many decisions come from a place of fear. Before we sort of dive deeper into differentiating the different types of fear and the stuff you were just talking about there, just a final word. I mean, clearly you and Gareth were a match made in heaven from that point of view, because I think the thing what struck me about Gareth was he'd been through the worst possible thing, in missing that penalty in 96. He had been to the place of fear. And I can only imagine that he realised, well, okay, it's not ideal, but actually it's not as bad as I imagined it would be. So I don't know if you agree with that, but also then clearly, like I said, you matched up so well.
Our attitude and philosophy matched up really well. Yeah, absolutely. And he's just a really solid, mature person. So he's somebody who I think had done the meaning making from his own journey, not just the penalty, but his experience in 96, but also through his whole life. He's a mature person, he's a thinker, and centrally he is very much person oriented. He really genuinely cares for the players and for the staff equally, so he's easy to be around. And he's I couldn't have asked for a better coach to be in charge and to lead from that perspective of changing culture. It made the work much, much easier for sure.
Yeah, he's a rare breed of leader, isn't he? He's that kind of new breed. I think of other great leaders currently, or the more evolved perhaps leaders. So like Jacinda Ardern, that kind of emotionally intelligent, take people along with you type of approach, rather than kind of I'm in charge, do what I say, and it's more like, look, we're in this together.
Yeah, and just he's a very likable person. But it's way more than that. It's an investment in the outcome for the other. I think that in leadership, when we see leaders, that's what I like about Jacinda. She's deeply purposeful. She knows who she is, and she is really invested in outcomes for other people. So her compassion shows up readily. And, I just hope that, you made the distinction between the new breed and the rare breed. I really hope it's the new breed rather than the odd one out, because we are ready for some of that.
Well, I think books like yours, Kath's, Jacinda, Gareth, people like that, it's definitely becoming more and more. And then there perhaps are other leaders who are a bit more. It's not about collaboration, it's about competition. It's that kind of zero-sum game, isn't it? It's like, I can only win if you lose.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, competition's a natural phenomena, and nothing wrong with competition per se. But this deep drive to, as you say, zero-sum game is the problem. So this deep drive to conquer, to win, to, our language around war and battle is really... it's not taking us in the right direction in terms of either leadership or flourishing or even our potential on the sports field. It means that there is only one way to be. There is only one archetype, and it's unimaginative. I think it's, I would go as far as saying it's a lazy way to motivate people. And it's absolutely going to rake up fear for most people most of the time. It's a kind of motivation that might get you a lift at half time. And if you don't have any care for the mental rent that costs people that you're dealing with, then, that's one way to operate. But I think it's a shallow way to operate. And I think that there is much, much more available that sets hearts and minds on fire rather than leaves people shaking in their boot trying to be obedient and conform to what you want so that they avoid the consequences.
Yeah, and it's that is exactly what you're talking about, or you're painting the picture of winning shallow or winning deep, and that is what winning shallow is. And we'll get on to winning deep, but let's just quickly let's differentiate between the obvious fear, so the helpful fear, let's call it that. I can't remember how you refer to it, but it's the kind of fear, let's say, that when our body takes over, when there's a tiger rushing at us, or we step into a road and there's a car coming and it forces us to leap out of the way. That's the good fear. But then there's the psychological fear, isn't there? Which you call the not good enough fear. So it's making that key distinction between the two.
Yeah, I mean, they're both psychological fears. The way I describe it is we have in the moment fear, as you say, which is the tiger running towards you, or Richie McGraw running towards you. But and that's a natural and necessary warning system. Fear is a warning system. It's an energy that's generated out of a stimulus that is a warning system to say, get ready to react, fight, flight, etc. And we'd be in trouble without it. We absolutely need it. We don't want to be fearless. That's why the book's called Fearless, because we need it. We don't want, we don't want to be so unfeeling that we don't respond to emotion in that way. However, we have way too much of it, and it's not very discerning. So we do need to intervene in the moment fear to turn off the hazard lights. We need to boss it quickly. We need to act quickly to do something about that. And I talk about the various techniques of doing that. And then there is this other kind of fear, which is not good enough fear. And that is the deeper psychological angst of whether you will be good enough, whether you will be abandoned. And that is pervasive and joy stealing, fulfillment stealing in all of our lives to some degree or other. And my proposition is that that's what really lurks in the corners and disguises itself in many, many different forms of negative emotion. That's what's really troubling us. In the moment fear, it's natural, it happens, we need it, and we just need to learn how to deal with it. But then there's this other stuff, and I don't think we're addressing the other stuff adequately.
I said one's perhaps more psychological than the other because it's like that the story of a guy who sees a rope at dusk and he leaps back, and then his mind comes in and goes, oh no, that's not a snake, that is a rope. And I call it the psychological fear because it's based around stories, which is that sense of abandonment that you're talking about, that fear of it, that deep fear of abandonment that is in all of us, and fear of rejection, fear of making a fool of ourselves, or whatever it may be. It's all bound up in stories, whereas the other tends to be more of a visceral, quick. It happens before thought can come in and add a story to it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a really nice distinction. It's a neuropsychologically, it's still psychology in that way. It's our deep unconscious leaping forward and acting half a second before we've had any opportunity for the frontal cortex to get involved. So we're always that half second behind our instincts, which is why it will always be there. But you're right, the storied sort of understandings that we layer in and our culture layers in over time are where all of the other fear sits. And we're all, humans are born as one of the most vulnerable mammals. We're vulnerable for the longest period of time. A human child is absolutely helpless without an adult or a carer. So, we learn very early to understand survival and to understand our need for attachment, our need not to be abandoned. And our fear systems are developed before we're even born. It's that important to us. So, my proposition is that we really don't need to layer in any more culturally. There's plenty there, and it's very easily triggered. So, the stories that we tell, the pen is in our hand in the stories that we tell. And we have to be very careful not to load and layer them with more fear, because that's going to take us in the wrong direction.
And you say that we know, and I think this is a really nice distinction, we know when we've lost our way, when either we want to be better than others or we fear rejection to others. So it's that kind of subject-object competition.
Yes, yeah. I mean, being better than others, there's sort of pride in having won something. I don't have a problem with that, but it's where that being better means that you have to be unassailable and nobody can get close. You being a winner means somebody else is a loser. That's where the problem comes in. Mm-hmm. So, finding your very best, they're the people we have admired, through history the most, people who have really explored what's possible and progressed humankind. That's not the problem. It's the idea that somebody else has to lose because you have to dominate. You have to be the conqueror. the unassailable. That's where I think the problem starts.
It's a primitive outlook, isn't it? And you talk about some of the beliefs that are perhaps pretty unconscious, or certainly pretty unconscious. For example, and we touched on it there, the idea that someone else has to lose, and how easy it is for people to internalize that, because, you know, losing in and of itself is not only not a bad thing, it's an important thing. Success is, or achievement is, only fully appreciated when you've had to go through loss and defeat, if you like. But you make this really nice distinction between losing and being a loser.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, failure is not only useful, it's inevitable. You know, if anybody who endeavours and is trying something new or trying to push forward is going to fail. And if we see that as just unacceptable or shaming in some way, then how much less likely are we to be open to trying again, open to pushing a bit further, to literally getting back in the arena one way or another. It's just not a useful perspective on the pursuit of your potential. So I think that, you know, it's a really interesting opportunity we have to open that idea up, that somebody has to be a loser. If somebody loses, they are a loser, because it's all coming from fear of you not being good enough, this scarcity mentality that there isn't enough success to go around. And so you've got to get your slice and not share it.
I really enjoyed, I mentioned Kath Bishop as well, Annie Vernon, who was in the same sort of, well, just slightly after Kath in that Olympic rowing setup. And she got a silver with Catherine Granger in 2008. And they were absolutely dead set on winning. And what's interesting with both Kath and Annie was how they did internalize that for a period, that kind of, oh, I've lost, therefore that says something about me as a person. And then they went on a process of unraveling that's led them both to write fascinating books. And being able to separate our sense of self from let's say, not, I like what Dave Allred, who I know you know, talks about, you know, it's not losing, or it's just not being able to match your intention. Like, I really like that separating outcome from what it says about us and our sense of self-worth.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the outcome's just the outcome. You know, the measure, really, the soul level measure is who were you in that competition? Did you do that with every bit of your own values and your own intention absolutely illuminated? Did you really leave nothing out there? And that's a wonderful measure of humanity and of our humanity. So I agree with Dave Allred in that this idea of matching your intention, but the outcome is just the outcome, you know. And I really feel it's a loss to focus entirely on the silverware or the podium, and I do worry about the effect that has on mental health of people being able to reconcile their whole identity with having achieved a result, rather than being on this extraordinary journey to find their very, very deepest strength.
A couple of the other success beliefs that you wanted to challenge, I'll just rattle through them quickly and then focus on one or two that I thought were really interesting. So you talk about the misconception that fear is a really good motivator, that that feelings are for failures, and you've got to sacrifice other things. For example, you might have to sacrifice being a good parent or a good husband or whatever, or even a nice person in the pursuit of success. So those are all myths. But the one that I really would like to zero in on is the whole in-group, out-group. So tribalism is exacerbated hugely by fear. And I thought this was so interesting because, again, everything's so tribal right now.
Yeah, fear is at the heart of tribalism. Fear is at the heart of tribalism becoming too strong. So belonging is, when you think of your tribe or your clan or your family even, that sense of belonging and pride in belonging and pride in the cultural identifiers is a wonderful thing. And that's a big part of something like football or sport. get such joy and pride from that. And I don't think there's anything drastically wrong with that. However, when fear of loss and scarcity comes in, we start to, that tribalism can extend way too far, and it becomes us and them. It becomes, 2 world wars and 1 World Cup kind of mentality. And there is a hatred that's just around the corner from that kind of fearful or fear-laced tribalism. That's again, I just don't see its value in everything that sport can be. I think that it's a limited view of what's possible. And again, if you're a Red, fantastic, and the pride in that, and the heritage, and the family connections, and the sense of connectivity across communities, there is so much richness in that kind of belonging, that kind of connectivity, and tribe in that sense. But tribalism that becomes fearful and hateful has no place.
It'd be really nice if that kind of tribalism that spills over into vicious arguments on social media or vicious fights outside football grounds or many other places, if people all understood exactly what you're saying, which is that, if you're doing that, it's coming from a place of fear.
Or inadequacy, which is the same kind of, same bucket, really. If somebody's feeling like they have to find the loser in the other, somebody's feeling like they have to be better than, that it's, there has to be a violent encounter of some kind to demonstrate your love for your team. It's gone askew. It's coming out of scarcity and fear. And I think there's just so much more richness. You always see this at a World Cup, some of the amazing scenes of fans from all over the world, from different nationalities and teams, arm in arm and enjoying themselves. You always see these moments, these bursts of humanity and connectivity that are just so cool, and just really the essence of what sport has to offer in belonging and shared pride, even when you are on opposing teams. So, to still feel your national pride or your team pride, and not have it turn into a fear of losing is, that would be a good objective.
Before we move on to sort of facing fear and your see it, face it, replace it, a quick note on you say, how fear makes you controlling. And I know this in myself, just to give a quick example, like if I'm preparing for a podcast and I'm a bit worried about it, I'll want to control it to the nth degree. But I know it will go better if I've done my prep and then I let it go and respond in the moment rather than try and control the interaction too much. And I think that can be applied in so many ways.
I think, discipline is a really very valuable thing when it comes to performance of any kind. And there's many things that we want to be able to control. It's over control. So again, where the pendulum swings too far, so that you want to control, for example, the type of interaction that you have, and you can't leave any space for what's naturally there. When you're in a conversation and you're thinking about what you want to say next rather than listening to what the person is saying, there's a degree of control of how the conversation is going to go, and you take something away from the interaction. You don't allow anything to emerge that you haven't pre-thought, and it's much less rich. So I agree with you that control, doing the prep and control to a degree is a really valuable thing, but then can you also leave space? Can you also be present and aware and just allow what's there to show up?
Listen, be present. It's about connection, isn't it? Because if you've got thoughts, there's a barrier between you and the other person, essentially. Right. Let's get on to your see it, face it, replace it. And the first being, see it and face it, really. So this idea that, invulnerability is too common. We're all vulnerable. We all have fears. Rather than turning away from them, it's actually having the bravery to look the fear straight in the face.
Yes. I think it's sort of a kind of a 45-degree turn on how we see bravery. So what I'm inviting the reader to do is be brave in seeing where the fear is, rather than bravely push through it and cope with it and ignore it, cope with it or ignore it. The bravery is actually in staying still and pausing and putting all four corners of your feet on the ground and saying, what am I really worried about here? What sits underneath? Like, lift the corner of the rug. What might be, as I said before, what might be exposed? What is the worst that could happen? Who triggers me? How do I behave in those circumstances? What kind of circumstance do I feel okay, and what kind of circumstance do I tighten up and feel, an anxious knot in my gut? And start to have a look at those things, and really spend the time analysing and evaluating what that fear really is for you, because then you're going to be working on the right stuff. And then with facing fear, this is about, once you've sort of said, okay, well, actually, I'm just really worried about, let's say, if I take an example from my own life, if I think, okay, when I'm in a room, early career for me, if I was in a room and I was the only woman in the room, and it was accomplished, professional, ex-professional players, men, footballers, AFL footballers, and everybody else knew the game inside out, and I didn't know the game inside out, hadn't grown up with it, and I was there for a particular reason. I was allowed in the tent, but I would feel a degree of fear that I was going to be exposed in some way by not having the currency that they had, and not having the cred that they had. So what that did for me was manifest in me having to have everything right, me feeling a fear of not being good enough in those environments, until I actually worked out what my niche was and how to get good at my niche, and recognise that that was going to add value, and that was enough. So, I had to really first face the fact that I was afraid of being shown up in that circumstance, or not knowing, or, being asked a question I couldn't answer. And then I had to face what that was costing me. So that meant that I didn't raise my voice when I could have or should have. It meant that I didn't take a position of perhaps guiding or challenging a coach where they needed it, because I didn't want to look dumb, or I didn't want to look like I didn't understand the game. So it made me less effective at my role, as well as, had an energy cost, a very strong energy cost, to constantly be in those environments and feel like I was an imposter. So, it took some unraveling, and then to sort of say, well, then how will I replace that? What works for me in replacing that? And that's the invitation, to really look at it, see it first, face what it's costing you, and then match that up with your own values and what you want to be, or what you want to be able to do, and decide how you're going to fix that.
And then in terms of your see it, face it, replace it, so you talk about replace it, and you talk about stories. So it's the story of who we are, the story of what's happened to us, the story of what may happen to us in future. And, for some people that may be a story that does themselves down. For some people, it may be a story that aggrandizes themselves. So you talk about replacing stories.
And sometimes those stories haven't come from our own generation. They're cultural stories. The cultural stories about what kind of people can achieve. I talk about Akala, the example from Akala, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, his brilliant book. And he talks in that about being a mixed race school kid in London, and how the teachers' expectations about what mixed race or black and brown kids could achieve had such a profound impact. That narrative had such a profound impact on so many of his peers, and they didn't feel the agency. They didn't feel like they actually had a pen in their hand of the ideas that ran their life, or the narratives that ran their life. And you can say the same with any form of inequity, or any sort of idea. I talk in the book about, people from my family don't go to uni, or, blue collar workers will never get that kind of job. the sort of the narratives and stories and ideas we have about what is and isn't possible. Sometimes they're culturally embedded, not self-generated. But then those self-generated ones, those ideas we have about ourselves, layer in on top of that, and they can sway it too. But the whole point is, really, you have much more agency than you think, much more decision-making capability, and much more potential to change that narrative, to decide what ideas you're going to live by and what chapter you're going to write next for yourself than we think.
Johnny Wilkinson said something that really I really enjoyed when I spoke to him a few months back, and he said that the stories he would tell about himself would depend on his mood and where he was in his life. And so he questioned himself. He could have different versions of stories about the same event. So he would say, well, okay, so which of the stories is true? And he said, well, actually, none of them can be true. Essentially, all stories to some degree are a fiction.
Yeah.
And something you said at the end of the book, which I really like. In fact, the very last line of your book is, life is just this moment. And when people are present, when people are in flow or seeking effortlessness, like Goldie says, which said to me, when we are in the moment, we lose ourselves and the stories disappear. When all the stories drop away, that's when we're truly content. I'm just interested to hear what you make of that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And that I think that those moments of flow and presence are so precious when we can get those. And there are many times in life when we can't get that, and we're just going about our culture, our business, enmeshed in a web of culture and stories, which my view is that we can also adjust and edit those much more than we think. And then, those precious moments of freedom from those are a high value commodity when we can get them. But, an interesting way to think about it for me, Simon, is archetypes. So this, instead of there being this one central pure truth, there are so many different archetypes and versions and ways, different parts of ourselves that show up at different moments. Sometimes you're the hero, sometimes you're the victim, sometimes you're you can have any kind of archetype, like a rescuer or a great dad or a scholar or a football teammate, any kind of archetype you can bring to the table, and they're all true. They're all parts and versions of this one complex life that we lead, this one complex thing we call a person. So, there isn't necessarily this central truth. And I think the more that we try and, in a Cartesian way, just channel down to this sort of, doubtless truth is troubling. I think that we can be a bit more imaginative than that, and have a bit more room for ambiguity than that, and tolerate it. That doesn't take away from our potential in any way.
And final couple of things, Pippa, that I thought were really beautiful, like almost a manifesto that you came out with in terms of, once we see our fear and acknowledge our fear and understand where it's showing up, whether it be in shaming ourselves, shaming others, wanting to beat someone, scared of being rejected by someone, tribalism, all these different things that we've discussed. And you talk about replacing fear with surrender, the importance of connection, vulnerability, and purpose. So yeah, just to finish, can you just talk about replacing fear or leaning in the direction of surrender, connection, and purpose, which all for me fall under the bracket of love. And just a quick side note, a famous psychologist, psychiatrist, I can't remember, talked about there are ultimately only being two emotions. And you allude to this about fear or love.
Yeah, I totally agree. They all fit under the banner of love, or a manifestation of love in our lives. It's underrated. And if we think about surrender, I'm talking there about useful surrender, about not assuming all the weight of the world and control on your own two shoulders, and allowing the idea that there are other forces in the world that are conspiring one way or the other to support you and to give you resources, or surrendering control when you've done everything you can and you want to just be in the moment. I talk about as well connection and intimacy, as we mentioned, being really so central to be able to just find the richness and depth in relationships, genuine, authentic relationships with other people. That's the real elixir of life. And I think from a purpose point of view, purpose is not the same as a goal. Goals are valid and wonderful and very, very useful in our lives. We're very goal-oriented as a species, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, purpose is about finding that sense of meaning that's outside of you. It's about what can you do beyond yourself that is some way compelling in terms of others, social impact, other kinds of relationships. You know, what are you giving your energy to? What are you giving your time and your talent to that's outside of yourself that brings deep reward and meaning? And that doesn't have to be grand. The humble is as great as the grand in that respect. And the more that we can uncover those things, and it's quite often uncovering them rather than adding them, the more we can uncover those things in life and have those as anchors, genuine foundations to our way of being, the less room fear has at the table.
Just a final thought, which is, you come up with this beautiful line that, with fear is this belief that perhaps we need fixing, but actually, the human experience as humans, we're all messy, and that should be celebrated as much as success, and messiness and growth sort of go hand in hand.
Well, I think, at this moment in time where we're in a very unusual state where there's lots of fear being raked up, and in the face of sort of the pandemic, the one thing I would encourage people to do is to recognize that we're, as a very adaptable creature, as a human being, not to over adapt towards fear. And just as you said then, Simon, to just leave the space open for love, for possibility, for surrender, for keeping your feet on the ground and making different choices. You've got more agency right now than you think when it comes to your mentality, even if not in terms of your circumstances. So I just encourage everybody to leave that space right now in terms of what the next period of time looks like for us all.
Dr. Pippa Grange, like I said, I've been desperate to talk to you for, truth be told, well over a year now, and it's lived up to easily and exceeded expectations. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for coming on. It's been a real joy.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundie, and Dr. Pippa Grange. I'd be delighted to hear from you, so please do get in touch via my website, simonmundie.com.